The wind in dry mesa had a habit of stealing your words right out of your mouth. It was a constant presence, scouring the high red plateau, rattling the spines of the yucca plants, and carrying the grit of two territories, Arizona and New Mexico, in its every breath. The year was 1884, and the town lived on silver dust and the lowing of cattle waiting for the railroad. It was a place of harsh edges, dry washes that could turn to raging torrents, sandstorms that could strip paint from a wagon, and nights so cold they felt like hammered steel against the skin. Eliza Hart knew this land in her bones. At 28, her hands were not soft, calloused from mending fences and working the small printing press her father had left behind. Her gaze was as direct and unsparing as the midday sun. She wore her father's death like a winter coat, a weight that had settled deep inside her a year ago after a dubious mining accident that everyone seemed too quick to forget. The grief was a quiet thing, a hollow space where his booming laugh and the smell of ink used to be. Today, the wind brought visitors. 2 men on horses too fine for the country, their hats clean and their boots polished. They did not work for a living, not in the way Eliza understood it. They worked for Bartholomew Pike, the man whose name was hammered onto every silver ingot and rail spike in the county. He was a shadow that stretched from the mines to the State House. And these were 2 of his fingers. They dismounted at her fence line, leaving the gate closed. A small courtesy that felt more like a calculation than respect. Eliza watched them from the porch, her rifle leaning just inside the door. She did not pick it up, not yet. The taller of the 2 men smiled, a bright, predatory flash of teeth. He introduced himself and his partner, though their names were as fleeting as dust devils. They were here on behalf of Mr. Pike, he explained, with a most generous proposition. Mr. Pike, in his great vision for the future of Dry Mesa, required unimpeded access to certain resources, namely, the deep-fed aquifer that ran beneath the Hart property, the only reliable source of water for 10 miles in any direction. In exchange for selling the water rights, they presented a leather folio. Inside, they said, was a deed to a sizable parcel of land closer to the railway, and a velvet pouch heavy with the promise of diamonds. A new start, they called it, a chance for a woman alone to live in comfort, away from all this dust and trouble. Eliza listened without expression. She looked past them, to the small wooden cross on the hill where her father was buried. He had loved this arid, stubborn piece of ground. He believed water was not something to be owned, but a trust. She finally met the man's smile with her own cool gaze. She said, "My father did not raise me to trade a birthright for trinkets." The water stays. Her voice was calm, final. The man's smile tightened. He suggested she reconsider. "The frontier was a dangerous place," he murmured, his tone dripping with false concern. "Especially with the Navajo. So unsettled. A woman alone is a target." He said Mr. Pike's protection would be a valuable asset. Eliza's hands clenched at her sides. She told them the only protection she needed was leaning against her doorframe. She suggested they enjoy the ride back to town. They left, the dust from their fine horses mingling with the red dirt of her land. But they left a chill behind them, a greasy residue in the clean, dry air. That night, Eliza was restless. She sat with her father's old ledger, the pages filled with his neat, blocky handwriting, notes about crop yields, cattle prices, and, in the final months, cryptic entries about Pike consolidated and falsified survey lines. He had been investigating something that ended with a snapped rope and a long fall. The smell of smoke woke her from a light, troubled sleep. It was sharp, acrid, the scent of burning hay and old wood. She grabbed the rifle and was out the door in a heartbeat. The barn was a roaring inferno, a brilliant orange wound against the black, star-dusted sky. Her 2 horses screamed in terror, their eyes wide and white. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. She fired a shot into the air, hoping the sound might scare off whoever was responsible, then ran toward the flames. The heat was a physical blow, stealing her breath. She worked the latch on the corral. her fingers clumsy in the searing air, and slapped the rumps of the panicked animals, driving them out into the open pasture. They galloped into the darkness, their fear a tangible thing. She could not save the barn. She stood, helpless, her face lit by the destructive glow, and watched the roof collapse in a shower of sparks. The home she had shared with her father, the place filled with the ghosts of his labor and his love, was turning to ash. As dawn broke, painting the smoke-filled sky in bruised shades of pink and gray, she walked the perimeter. The tracks were obvious in the soft earth. Hoof prints, unshod ponies, the kind the Navajo often rode. But something was wrong. They were too clean, too deliberate, and mixed among them. She found another print, faint but unmistakable, the heel of a cavalry boot, worn down in a particular way. It was a clumsy attempt at forgery, meant to be seen and misinterpreted. Her heart grew cold and hard in her chest. This was not a random raid. This was a message, signed with fire. Later that morning, another pair of visitors arrived. This time, it was Sheriff Kincaid, his belly straining the buttons of his vest, and the county commissioner, a man with a perpetually worried expression and shifty eyes. They stood over the smoldering ruins, shaking their heads with practiced solemnity. "A terrible business," the commissioner said, wringing his hands. "A clear escalation. The Navajo are growing bold." Sheriff Kincaid nodded, avoiding Eliza's gaze. He pointed to the hoof prints. "Plain as day," he said, his voice heavy with false authority. "We have been warning about this. You cannot manage this ranch alone. Miss Hart, it is a provocation." Eliza looked from one man to the other. "She said it was not Navajo. The tracks are faked." The sheriff scoffed, a little too quickly. "Now, Miss Hart, let us not get carried away with grief. I know a raid when I see one." He went on to say that for her own safety, and for the peace of the entire region, she needed to accept help. As it happened, Bartholomew Pike had made a generous offer of protection. He was willing to station his own security men on her property to prevent any further misunderstandings. It was, the commissioner added, the only responsible thing to do. To refuse would be to invite more conflict. The trap was laid, neat and tidy. They were using the fire they had set to force her into the very deal she had refused. The rage that simmered in her was cold and clear. She looked at the two men, their faces earnest and false, and saw the whole rotten structure of power and dry mesa. She told them she would not be needing Mr. Pike's protection. She would handle this herself. The commissioner looked horrified. "That is unwise," he stammered. "You are inflaming a delicate situation." Eliza's voice was quiet, but it cut through the morning air. "The only thing inflamed here, sir, is my barn. I will find who did this, and I will do it without the help of the man who stands to gain the most from my ruin." She turned her back on them and walked toward her house, the rifle now held firmly in her hands. She knew her next move. Her father had spoken of an old limestone well, a place where the water table was so high you could see it shimmer in a deep crevice in the rock. It was on the edge of her property, a place few people knew about. If they were after her water, they would have scouted it. There might be more signs there. The ride out was tense. The sun beat down, and the familiar landscape felt alien, menacing. Every shadow could hold a threat. She dismounted near the rock formation her father had described and tethered her horse to a hardy scrub oak. The air was still, heavy, too still. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the silence. The bullet whizzed past her ear, close enough to feel its heat, and slammed into the rock face behind her, spraying stone chips. Another shot kicked up dust at her feet. She dove for cover behind a cluster of boulders, her heart pounding against her ribs. She was pinned down, an easy target. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A figure detached itself from the landscape, a man who seemed to be woven from the very earth and shadows of the canyon. He was tall and lean, moving with a fluid grace that was utterly silent. He carried no rifle, His hands were empty. He was dying. His black hair was tied back with a simple leather thong. His face was stark and angular, his eyes dark and direct. He moved in a low crouch, circling behind the unseen shooter's position. There was a sudden scuffle, a choked cry, and then silence. After a long moment, the Navajo man appeared at the edge of her rock shelter. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, then gestured with his head toward the ridge. "It is done," he said. His voice was a low baritone, as quiet as his movements. Eliza cautiously emerged from her cover. A man in dusty work clothes lay on the ground, a length of rawhide binding his hands, his rifle several feet away. The Navajo stood over him, impassive. He nudged the attacker's boot with his own moccasin-clad foot. "He is a miner from Pike's Silver Claim," the man said. He pointed to the ground near where the ambusher had been hiding. "Your attackers last night, they wore boots like this. They do not know how to walk like a warrior. They walk heavy, like they are afraid the earth will not hold them." He looked at Eliza, and for the first time she felt seen not as a landowner or a target, but simply as a person. His gaze was honest, holding no pity, only a calm assessment of the facts. She led him back to the ranch, to the blackened skeleton of her barn. He walked the ground again, his eyes missing nothing. He confirmed her suspicions, pointing out the subtle scrapes and scuffs that no horse thief would make, details left by men unaccustomed to staging a raid. They stood in the ruin, the smell of wet ash sharp in the air. Eliza knew she could not do this alone. She needed a guide, someone who knew the land and the ways of the people who were being framed. She needed someone who could see the truth beneath the lies. "I need to find the rest of them," she said, her voice raw. "I need to prove what they did." The man watched her, his silence a deep well. She took a breath. "I will pay you. I do not have much coin, but my father left me a printing press. I publish a small news sheet for the town. If you guide me, help me track them, I will print the truth. I will tell everyone that the Navajo had nothing to do with this. I will clear your people's name. It was an offer not of money, but of justice, a promise to wield the one weapon she had left." He considered this for a long time, his eyes on the distant mesas, red and ancient in the afternoon light. Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. 3 days. He said, "I will give you 3 days." His name, he told her, was Hastian Nez. Some called him Black Horse. Relief washed over Eliza, so potent it almost buckled her knees. She had an ally, a chance. She looked at the quiet, imposing man before her, a stranger who had saved her life and now held her future in his capable hands. "You do not say much, do you?" she observed, a hint of her usual wryness returning to her voice. Hastian Nez looked toward the western sky, where the wind was beginning to pick up again, whistling through the canyon. "The wind speaks for me," he replied. The first of the 3 days began not with a bang, but with a whisper of displaced stones. Hastian Nez moved ahead of Eliza, his feet seeming to read the ground rather than merely walk upon it. He did not follow the obvious trail of shod horses, but cut across a rocky slope where the tracks were fainter, harder to see. He pointed to a long scratch on a sandstone boulder. "A shod horse," he said. "Its iron shoe slipped here. A dying pony would have found its footing." He spoke as if the land itself were telling him its story. They found the raiders' first camp in a shallow arroyo, a place chosen for concealment. The ashes of their fire were cold, but the signs were fresh. Hastian knelt and sifted through the dirt. He held up a small, dark flake on his palm. "Blasting powder," he said, "from the mines." He then pointed to a dark stain on a rock, grease from a lantern wick. Not tallow or tallow candles, miner's grease. Every piece of evidence spoke not of a native war party, but of laborers from Pike's operation, men who lived by the clock and the dynamite fuse, not by the sun and the silent arrow. The trail led them toward dry mesa. They needed supplies, and Eliza needed to gauge the town's temper. As they rode down the single dusty street, windows and doorways filled with curious, hostile eyes. The sight of a white woman riding alongside a Navajo man was enough to stop conversations and turn heads. Hastian seemed oblivious, his gaze fixed forward, but Eliza felt the weight of their judgment like a physical shroud. She tied their horses outside the general store and post office, a cluttered building that smelled of coffee beans, leather, and dried apples. Inside, a stout, gray-haired woman with kind, shrewd eyes looked up from behind the counter. This was Aunt May, the town's unofficial midwife, postmistress, and keeper of secrets. She had delivered Eliza and had been a friend to her mother. Aunt May's eyes flickered toward the street. "Trouble finds you, child," she said, her voice a low murmur. "It found my barn first," Eliza replied. "I need coffee, flour, and jerky, and I need to know what people are saying." Aunt May measured out the coffee beans, her movements efficient and practiced. "They are saying what Pike wants them to say." She said that the Navajo have broken the peace, that a woman alone cannot hold a ranch. Bartholomew Pike is a patient man. He poisons the well and then sells the water. Eliza paid for her goods, her jaw tight. She asked Aunt May to hold them for her. First, she had another stop to make. The saloon was buzzing with midday drinkers, miners and ranch hands filling the air with thick smoke and loud talk. When Eliza pushed through the swinging doors, a hush fell over the room. Hastian stood just behind her, a silent, statuesque presence that immediately drew every eye. Eliza walked to the bar. The bartender, a man with a stained apron and a sour expression, deliberately wiped down a clean spot in front of her. "What will you have, miss?" he asked, his eyes cutting past her to Hastian. "2 coffees," Eliza said clearly. The bartender's eyes narrowed. "I can serve you, ma'am, but I do not serve his kind." A low murmur of approval went through the room. Eliza felt a hot flash of anger. She placed her coins on the bar. "Then I will take 1 coffee to go." She turned and walked out, Hastian following. Back at the general store, she bought a second cup from Aunt May, who had watched the whole exchange from her window with a sad shake of her head. Outside, Eliza handed the tin cup to Hastian. He took it without a word, his expression unchanged. She could not help a small, weary smile. "You owe me a coffee," she said. He took a slow sip, his eyes scanning the unforgiving landscape that stretched before them. "I will pay you back," he replied, with a shortcut through the desert. They rode out of town, leaving the simmering hostility behind. They made camp that evening in the shelter of a rock overhang, while Eliza prepared a simple meal. Hastian inspected the gear they had taken from the ambusher, from a hidden pocket in the saddlebag. He pulled out a rolled-up piece of oilcloth. He spread it on a flat rock. It was a drawing, a technical plan, showing a pipeline running from a source-marked limestone well directly to the railway line. In the bottom corner, a neat stamp read Cerridito Pike Consolidated. The air went out of Eliza's lungs. It was here, the proof, the entire motive, drawn out in black ink. Her father had been right. The thought struck her with the force of a physical blow. Back at the ranch, after Hastian had settled down for the night, she lit a lamp and unlatched her father's old wooden chest. She pulled out his final journal. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages. There it was, entry after entry, documenting his suspicions. He had recorded conversations, noted the arrival of Pike's surveyors, and sketched his own rough maps of the water table. He had been gathering evidence, building a case. The final entry, dated 2 days before his death, read, "Pike knows I am onto him. He is trying to buy the water, but he will try to take it if he cannot. I fear I have been too careless. I should have told Eliza everything." A wave of guilt and sorrow washed over her. She had thought him obsessed, a man chasing shadows after her mother's passing. She had listened with half an ear, distracted by her own life, never truly believing the danger was real. She had not trusted him completely, and now he was gone. She sat with the journal in her lap, the lamp flickering, and wept silent. Bitter tears for the faith she had failed to give him. She must have made a sound, because a little while later, Hastian was standing near the fire. He did not speak, simply added a piece of mesquite to the embers. The quiet gesture was one of comfort, not intrusion. He finally broke the silence, his voice low. "My people have a story about water," he said. "They say it holds the memories of the earth. When our ancestors were forced on the long walk, they prayed to the water to remember them, so they could find their way home. To Pike, this water is money. To my people, it is life. It is memory. It is sacred." He spoke of the Dean laws, how no single person could own a spring, for it belonged to all living things. Listening to him, Eliza felt a profound shift inside her. This was no longer just about her father's death or her land. It was about a way of seeing the world, a truth that the newspapers in the East, with their talk of manifest destiny and savage frontiers, could never comprehend. She was caught between two worlds, the one she was born into and the one this silent man was revealing to her. The next day, Hastian's shortcut took them across a wide, grassy plain belonging to a neighboring rancher, Mateo Cruz, a vaquero of quiet integrity who had been a friend to her father. As they crested a rise, they saw a flicker of orange against the twilight sky. It was another fire. They spurred their horses, a silent, urgent understanding passing between them. They found a man, his face masked by a kerchief, about to touch a flaming torch to a massive haystack, the winter feed for Mateo's entire herd. Hastian slid from his horse while it was still moving. He hit the man in a silent, rolling tackle that sent the torch flying. Eliza was right behind him, her rifle leveled. The fight was short and brutal. The man, whose name they would learn was Cole, was strong, but Hastian moved with a speed and certainty that was mesmerizing. He used the man's own momentum against him, ending with Cole flat on his stomach, his arm twisted behind his back. Just then, Mateo Cruz himself rode up, drawn by the commotion. He took in the scene, his eyes wide, then full of dawning comprehension and gratitude. He helped them tie Cole to a fence post. Under the cold light of the stars, with the thread of a lariat tightening around his neck, Cole started talking. He was a hired gun, paid well by Pike's foreman. This was all part of a plan. He bragged, a systematic campaign to drive out the small ranchers. The fires, the fake raids, it was all to create chaos. And it was just the beginning. The big push, he called it, a final clearing of the land, was coming soon. He did not know when, but he knew it would be decisive. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, a cold wind blew across the plain. They had a prisoner, a confession, and a blueprint. They had the truth, but as Eliza looked at the vast, empty land around them, she knew that in a place like Dry Mesa, the truth was only as powerful as the guns you had to back it up, and their guns were terribly few. The 3-day agreement dissolved in the cold light of the third dawn, replaced by an unspoken understanding. They were no longer a party to a contract. They were allies in a quiet war. Mateo Cruz, his face grim but resolute, pledged the eyes and ears of his fellow vaqueros. Eliza declared that she would resurrect her father's printing press and fight Pike with words and ink. Hastian Nez simply nodded. His role needed no definition. He would be the eyes of the land, the silent shield. The three of them stood in the shadow of the burnt-out barn, a small and determined triangle against a vast and hostile landscape. Eliza spent the next days in a fever of mechanical resurrection. The old Chandler and Price press was a heavy beast of iron and steel. Silent for a year, it fought her with rust and stiffness. Hastian watched her from the doorway of the small print shop, a space attached to the main house. She worked with a fierce concentration, her face smudged with grease, her hands stained with ink. She moved with an assurance that told him this machine was as much a part of her as her rifle. He saw her pause once, her hand resting on the flywheel, a shadow of memory crossing her face. He remained where he was, a still presence offering a strange, unspoken comfort. She looked up and caught his eye, a faint, weary smile touching her lips. "You should try smiling sometime," she said, her voice laced with tired humor. "You might find it changes the weather." He considered her words, his gaze as steady as a hawk's. "I am saving it," he replied, his voice a low rumble, "for after the sandstorm." His answer hung in the air between them, a small, perfectly formed thing. It was not a dismissal, but a promise of a future, a time beyond the present danger. It was the most hopeful thing she had heard in a year. Her first task was to print a small handbill, a simple statement of fact. It described the fire at her ranch, the evidence of shod horses and miners' tools, and the capture of one of the hired men. It made no grand accusations, but it planted a seed of doubt, a different story from the one being told in the saloons. She gave a stack to Mateo to distribute discreetly among the ranch hands and miners who were not on Pike's payroll. She also rode into Dry Mesa to see Aunt May. The older woman read the handbill, her lips a thin, firm line. "Words are good," she said, "but people are scared. They whisper, but they will not speak aloud." "Then let them whisper to you," Eliza urged. "You deliver their babies and their mail. They trust you. Gather their stories. What they have seen, what they have suffered. No names, just the truth of it. The beatings by Pike's security, the wages stolen, the unsafe conditions in the mine." Aunt May nodded slowly, her shrewd eyes calculating the risk. "There is a girl," she said, her voice dropping lower. "Nora Bloom. She works as a clerk at the courthouse, a quiet thing. Sharp as a tack. She sees the ledgers. She sees the land deeds Pike files, the ones signed by men who can barely write their own names. She might be a friend. I will ask." The whispers and the handbills did not go unnoticed. Bartholomew Pike responded not with words, but with the blunt instrument of the law. A new notice appeared on the sheriff's office door, signed by Sheriff Kincaid. It declared a town-wide curfew from dusk until dawn, citing the ongoing threat of native unrest, and, beneath that, another notice. A reward was offered for the capture of a dangerous Navajo male, wanted for questioning in connection with recent violence. The description was spare but damning. Tall, travels alone, known to be an expert tracker. It was a portrait of Hastian painted in fear. The net was tightening. They were being isolated, branded as criminals. The news came, as bad news often did, on the back of a tired horse. Mateo had been ambushed on the road back from delivering a packet of anonymous testimonies from a group of miners. He had been left for dead in a dry wash. Hastian found him. Following a trail a less skilled tracker would have missed completely. He rode back to the Hart Ranch in the dead of night, the unconscious vaquero draped over the front of his saddle. Mateo's face was a swollen mask, one arm bent at an unnatural angle. Eliza's first instinct was to ride for the doctor in town, but Hastian stopped her with a look. "The town doctor," he said quietly, "sets the bones Pike tells him to set. He will not help this man. He will report him." She watched, her heart a cold knot of fear. As Hastian carried Mateo inside and laid him gently on a cot, he worked with a calm, focused intensity. He cleansed the wounds not with whiskey, but with a dark, astringent solution brewed from boiled yucca root. He fashioned a splint for the broken arm from straight branches and strips of leather. He ground a handful of dried leaves into a paste, its scent sharp and earthy, and applied it as a poultice to the worst of the bruises. All the while, he chanted, a low, rhythmic sound that was less a song and more a vibration in the air, a prayer for healing directed at the earth itself. Eliza stood by with hot water and clean cloths, a reluctant assistant caught between the medicine of her world and the ancient knowledge of his. Doubt warred with a desperate hope. But as the night wore on and Mateo's breathing steadied, the doubt began to recede. She saw not a savage ritual, but a deep and profound connection to the world, a wisdom passed down through generations. She was witnessing an act of faith, and it was breeding faith in her. Toward dawn, Mateo's fever broke. Hastian sat back on his heels, his work done for the moment. The silence in the room was deep, broken only by the soft sounds of a sleeping man breathing. Eliza brought him a cup of coffee. He took it, his long fingers wrapping around the warm tin. They sat without speaking for a time. Eliza found her gaze drawn to the intricate braiding of his horse's reins, which hung from a peg by the door. She had noticed them before. They were not simple leather. Woven into the dark horsehair were other strands, some as black as his own, others with a hint of gray. He saw her looking. "My mother's hair," he said, his voice soft. "And my sister's. It is a way to keep them with me, a reminder of the path home." The simple statement landed with incredible weight. It was a window into the deep well of his past, into the loss that shaped his silence. She thought of her father's journal, of the way she held it to feel close to him. They were both anchored by ghosts, by memories braided into the very fabric of their lives. She felt a sudden urge to share something of her own. The limestone well, she said, "My father believed the stones around it were carved, ancient markings. He said it was a holy place, long before any of us came here." Hastian looked at her, a flicker of something deep and knowing in his eyes. "The Dain call it the place where the sky drinks. It is where stories are told to the water, so they will not be forgotten." In that moment, the space between them shrank. He was no longer just her protector, her guide. He was a man who understood the sacredness of memory, the way the land itself held the story of a people. The fear of losing her ranch, a fear that had been a constant, sharp-edged thing, began to feel smaller. The fight was becoming something larger, a struggle to keep a story from being erased, to keep the water from forgetting. A few days later, a patrol of 2 soldiers rode up to the ranch. They were led by a young corporal named Reeves. He had a ramrod straight posture and a face that had not yet learned how to hide his thoughts. He had been sent to investigate reports of an armed woman harboring a dangerous fugitive. Eliza met him on the porch, her rifle held loosely at her side. She did not invite him in. She told him her story, her voice steady and clear. She showed him the blueprint from the saddlebag. She pointed to the still-bound and sullen Cole, who had been secured in the empty spring house. Corporal Reeves listened, his expression shifting from official skepticism to troubled thought. He examined the tracks around the barn. He looked at the blueprint. He was a man of orders and regulations, but he was also a man with honest eyes. What he was seeing did not match the orders he had been given. "My captain reports to a territorial delegate who is a guest of Mr. Pike's every Christmas," he said, more to himself than to her. He shook his head. A man caught in a machine he was just beginning to understand. "I have my orders." "Ma'am," he said finally, "but they do not say I have to be blind." He tipped his hat. "Be careful," he said, and rode away. He was not yet an ally, but he was no longer an enemy. That night, Eliza laid out the evidence on her father's desk, the blueprint, the journal, Mateo's packet of testimonies, and her own notes. It was a story of systemic greed, of violence disguised as progress. She knew then that justice would not be won with a single gunfight at dawn. It would be won with these scraps of paper. It would be won with hard, undeniable proof, piece by painstaking piece. The memory that spurred her was a ghost from childhood, a fleeting image of her father, his face streaked with sweat and dirt, emerging from beneath the barn floor. He had been digging. He had told her, shoring up a weak foundation beam, but he had been secretive about it, and she remembered the distinct sound of a heavy metal lid closing. At the time, she had dismissed it as a child might. Now, the memory was a beacon. She returned to the ruins, the air still thick with the ghost of smoke. The blackened timbers lay like the bones of some great beast, and a fine layer of gray ash covered everything. She began to clear a section near where the hay stall had been, her hands raw, her muscles aching. Hastian worked beside her, his movements economical and powerful, lifting charred beams that she could not budge. He did not ask what she was looking for. He seemed to understand that she was following a map laid down in her own mind. Hours passed. The sun beat down, turning the ash-covered ground into a shimmering, desolate landscape. Just as she was about to give up, her shovel struck something that was not earth or stone. It was wood, flat and solid. They cleared the debris away to reveal the faint outline of a trap door. Its iron ring pull was fused with rust. Using a crowbar from the tool shed, they pried it open. A wave of cool, musty air rose to meet them. Below was a small, earth-walled cellar, no bigger than a pantry, and in the center of the dirt floor sat a heavy iron box, its surface pitted with rust. It was the source of the sound she had remembered all these years. They carried it back to the house, the weight of it a tangible thing, full of secrets. It was not locked with a key, but with a complex latch that took Eliza several minutes of patient work with a file and a bit of oil to open. The lid creaked open like a tomb. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, was her father's secret war. There was a ledger, its columns filled with his familiar, neat script. It was a meticulous record of payments, names next to dates and amounts. She recognized the names of local officials, foremen from the mine, even a territorial judge. It was a catalog of Bartholomew Pike's bribes. Tucked beneath it were letters, written in Pike's arrogant, sloping hand, outlining demands and threats, confirming the payments in the ledger. And then there was the map. It was not a sketch, but a professional survey, far more detailed than the one they had found in the ambusher's saddlebag. It showed the entire aquifer system, a web of underground rivers. The main pipeline was drawn in red ink, originating at the limestone well and cutting directly through a section of land designated as a dine winter camp. It was a plan not just for theft, but for the slow starvation of a people. Hastian traced the red line with his finger, his face a mask of stone. But it was the last letter at the bottom of the box that stopped Eliza's heart. It was not from Pike, but to him. The handwriting was the florid, self-important script of Sheriff Kincaid. The letter spoke of a strategy to create a pretense for seizing land. The sheriff wrote of organizing a few trusted men to stage raids, to leave unshod pony tracks, to make it look like the Navajo had broken the treaty. He was creating the very crisis he was supposed to be solving. Then Eliza read the final paragraph, and the air turned to ice in her lungs. Regarding the heart situation, the letter read, "I believe a more permanent solution is required. He has become too inquisitive. An accident in his own mind would be a sad but necessary tragedy, and would clear the final obstacle to our shared prosperity." The paper trembled in her hand. It was not an accident. It was an execution, a murder, planned and ordered by the man who wore a badge of honor in their town. The ambiguity that had haunted her for a year was gone, replaced by a terrible, searing certainty. Her father had not fallen. He had been pushed. She looked up at Hastian, her eyes burning with unshed tears and a cold, rising fury. He saw the truth in her face before she could speak. He took the letter from her shaking fingers and read it. A profound stillness came over him, the kind that precedes a storm. His jaw tightened, and a muscle worked in his cheek. The desire for vengeance was a palpable thing in the small room, a living entity with teeth and claws. For a long moment, he said nothing. He stared at the letter, at the names of the men who had destroyed so many lives. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "My father taught me that revenge is a wild horse," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "You do not leap on it while it is raging. You wait. You let it tire itself out. Then you lead it where you will." His words, born of a wisdom far older than the dusty streets of Dry Mesa, cut through her own blind rage. He was right. A rash move now would get them both killed. They had the truth, but the truth was a weapon that had to be wielded with precision. Their counsel was cut short by the sharp, ringing sound of a horse's shoe striking stone. Coming from the ridge overlooking the ranch, they were not alone. Hastian moved to the window. Peering through a crack in the shutter, he saw the glint of the sun on a rifle barrel. A sniper, positioned for a clear shot at the house. They left the box, There was no time. They slipped out the back, moving in a low crouch toward the relative cover of the creek bed. Another shot rang out, kicking up a spray of dirt just behind Eliza's heel. They were seen. The sniper was trying to pin them down, to hold them there until his companions could close in. They scrambled onto their horses, hidden in a small copse of cottonwoods. Their only escape was a narrow game trail that wound its way up the side of the mesa, a treacherous path with a sheer drop on one side. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had. They spurred their horses onto the trail, the animals' hooves clattering on the loose rock. The sniper's bullets whined past them. Chipping stone from the cliff face, the path grew narrower, the wind tearing at them. Hastian rode just ahead, a steady, reassuring presence. Suddenly, a bullet tore through the air with a vicious snap, and Eliza felt a sharp tug on her hands. One of her leather reins, frayed by the shot, parted. Her horse, a young mare, panicked at the loss of guidance and the proximity of the cliff edge. It shied violently, its back hooves skidding on the loose scree. Eliza cried out as she fought for balance, the canyon yawning beneath her. Hastian acted without hesitation, in a movement of breathtaking agility. He launched himself from his own saddle, not toward Eliza, but up the steep rock face beside the trail. He found handholds and footholds where there seemed to be none, scrambling upward with the speed and silence of a lizard. He was above the sniper now, who was so focused on the targets below that he never saw the shadow descending upon him. Hastian dropped onto the ledge behind the man. The sniper spun around, his rifle swinging up, but he was too slow. Hastian's foot shot out, kicking the rifle from the man's grasp. It clattered on the rocks and spun out into the empty air. The man lunged, a knife appearing in his hand. The fight was a blur of motion, a desperate struggle on a tiny precipice. Hastian did not meet the man's brute force with his own. He used his grace and balance, deflecting and turning, until he had the man off balance. A final, decisive shove sent the sniper stumbling backward over the edge. His scream was short, swallowed by the immense silence of the canyon. Hastian was already moving, sliding back down to the trail. Eliza's mare was still fighting her, wild-eyed with terror. He reached them just as the horse was about to bolt. He grabbed the bridle, his voice a low, calming murmur, speaking words in Dine that were like a gentle hand on the panicked animal's soul. The mare gradually quieted, its sides heaving, its fear subsiding under his touch. They found shelter in a shallow cave carved out by wind and time, a place to catch their breath as dusk began to bleed across the sky. The adrenaline drained away, leaving them cold and trembling. Eliza's hands shook so badly she could not strike a match to light the small fire Hastian had prepared. She tried twice, the sulfur head scraping uselessly against the stone. On her third try, his hand covered hers. It was large and warm, calloused but gentle. He did not take the match, but simply held her hand steady, his fingers enclosing hers until the shaking stopped. Together, they struck the match. The small flame sprang to life, fragile and bright in the growing darkness. "The long night will pass," he said, his voice quiet. The tiny flame was reflected in his dark eyes, a spark of light in a world of shadows. And in that shared light, Eliza felt a connection that went deeper than gratitude, a nascent trust that was as real and as warm as his hand covering hers. Before leaving the sniper's perch, Hastian had retrieved the man's saddlebags. Inside, he found another map, a copy of the one from her father's box. During the brief, violent struggle, the sniper had been cut, and a single, dark drop of his blood had fallen onto the paper. It had landed directly on the spot marked Limestone Well, a crimson stain on the source of their fight, a perfect, brutal symbol of what Pike was willing to spill to claim it. The news of the dead sniper traveled faster than a prairie fire. By the time they dared to venture near town, a new notice was posted. Bartholomew Pike had used his influence and his ledger full of names. Eliza Hart was no longer the victim. She was now a wanted criminal, accused of sabotage and consorting with a dangerous fugitive. A substantial reward was offered for her capture. They could not go back to the ranch. They could not go into town. They were hunted. That night, in the safety of Mateo's most remote line shack, they made a decision. They could not risk keeping all the evidence in one place. One lucky shot, one successful ambush, and it would all be lost. "We have to break it apart," Eliza said, her voice firm. "We have to trust our allies." Hastian nodded in the lantern light. He knew the hidden paths, the quiet ways between the dine camps. He could get messages out. They divided the contents of the iron box. The ledger would go to Nora Bloom, the courthouse clerk, who could compare it against the official records. The letters from Pike and the sheriff would go to Corporal Reeves, whose conscience was already troubled. The map, stained with blood, would go to Aunt May, who would hold it as the heart of their story. A young dine boy, a swift and silent runner, would be their link, a living thread in a network of quiet resistance. They were no longer just defending a piece of land. They were arming the truth itself. The idea came from Aunt May, spoken in the hushed, practical tone she used when discussing a difficult birth. They were fugitives in their own county, moving between the ranch and the hidden camps of the vaqueros, and the law was a weapon pointed directly at them. With Eliza, a wanted woman, Pike could have Sheriff Kincaid seize her land, her press, everything. A legal entanglement, Aunt May had said, her hands busy sorting mail she could not yet deliver. A complication. If you two were married, the property becomes a shared asset. He cannot be compelled to testify against you, nor you against him. It is a shield. Child, not of the heart, perhaps, but of the law. A shield is what you need right now. The logic was as stark and unyielding as the landscape. It was a proposal born not of romance, but of necessity, a strategic move on a battlefield of deeds and writs. Eliza presented the idea to Hastian that evening as they sat by the limestone well. An old woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, sat with them. Hastian had introduced her as Nuda, an elder of his clan, a keeper of stories. She had come at his request, her presence lending a quiet gravity to the place. Eliza explained the legal reasoning, her voice devoid of emotion, laying out the facts as if discussing a plan for a cattle drive. Hastian listened, his gaze fixed on the still, dark water in the crevice below. When she finished, he did not look at her, but at Nuda. The old woman nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion. "A bond made in the face of the storm is stronger than one made in the sun," Nuda said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "The water will bear witness." And so, under a sky the color of a fading bruise, they had their ceremony. Mateo Cruz stood as a witness, his hat held respectfully in his hands. Aunt May was there, her face a mixture of worry and fierce pride. Nuda officiated, not with a book, but with a handful of sacred corn pollen. She instructed them to face east, toward the rising sun they could not yet see. There were no rings, no promises of forever. Eliza simply said, "I will stand with you." Hastian's reply was just as simple, just as profound. "Our path is one." Nuda sprinkled the pollen on the ground before them, sealing a union that was both a legal maneuver and something far deeper, an alliance of two souls against a common enemy. They were returning to the hidden camp when they saw the riders, a delegation of 4 men led by the same smiling, predatory man from Pike's office who had first brought the offer of diamonds. They were coming not with guns drawn, but with the arrogant assurance of men who believed they had already won. They reined in their horses a respectful distance away, a mockery of courtesy. "Miss Hart," the man called out, his voice smooth and condescending. "We come in good faith. Mr. Pike is a forgiving man. He is willing to overlook your recent indiscretions. He is even willing to repeat his generous offer, the land by the railway, the diamonds, a full pardon for your crimes. All he asks is that you be reasonable." The wind picked up, whipping strands of hair across Eliza's face and pressing her dress against her. She sat tall in her saddle, Hastian a silent, watchful presence beside her. She looked at the man, at the pouch of jewels he held up, at the rolled deed in his other hand. She saw the smug certainty in his eyes. She let the silence stretch, let the wind have its say. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and carried on the gusting air. Not the voice of a fugitive, but of a historian setting the record straight. She did not speak of herself in the first person, but as if telling a story that would one day be legend. "They offered diamonds and deeds," she said, her eyes locking with the man's. She chose a Navajo warrior with bare hands and an honest eye. The man's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of pure fury. The story was not going the way he had written it. He spat on the ground, wheeled his horse around, and the four of them rode off in a cloud of red dust. Their mission a failure. The tale of that confrontation traveled faster than they did. By the time they slipped back into Dry Mesa for supplies 2 days later, the town was buzzing. Whispers followed Eliza down the street. Some were scornful, calling her a traitor to her own kind. Others were grudgingly respectful, the admiration of a people who, for all their faults, valued grit. As she passed the saloon, she saw the sign, freshly painted and nailed to the door. No Indians. The words were a physical insult, a casual cruelty that made her blood run hot. On impulse, she strode over to it, before anyone could react. She took hold of the rough wooden plank, ripped it from its nail, flipped it over, and with a piece of charcoal from a nearby fire pit, wrote 2 words on the back in bold, clear letters, "No bullies." She nailed it back in place, the defiant sound of the hammer echoing in the sudden silence of the street. She turned and saw Hastings watching her from across the street, and for the first time since she had met him, a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It transformed his stark features, lighting his eyes from within. It was a rare and beautiful thing, like a desert flower blooming after a flash flood. The sight of it made her own lips curve in response. "Be careful," she said, her voice full of a sudden, surprising lightness. "If you smile like that, the storm might change direction." The storm, however, did not change direction. It intensified. The next day, Mateo brought the news. A new notice was posted, this one carrying the full weight of the law, citing the clear and present danger of native insurrection, allegedly led by a renegade Navajo and his white collaborator. Sheriff Kincaid had signed an order of confiscation. The Hart Ranch and all its assets were to be seized in 72 hours. The countdown had begun. They returned to the ranch that night under the cover of darkness, not as fugitives, but as defenders making a last stand. As they approached, they saw a faint light in the window of the house. Their hands went to their weapons, but a voice called out, a voice they recognized. It was one of Mateo's vaqueros. "You have visitors," he said, stepping out of the shadows. "They are not Pike's men." Inside the small ranch house, a group of 5 men sat, their faces grimy with coal dust, their bodies slumped with exhaustion. They were miners, and their spokesman was a big man with a broken nose and weary eyes. "We heard what you did," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the town. "The sign. We heard about the stand you made. We have had enough of Pike. He cheats us on the scales, pays us in scrip for his own store, and sends us into shafts that are ready to collapse. He treats us like animals. We quit, but we have nowhere to go. We heard you might be in need of men who are not afraid of a fight." They had brought more than just their loyalty. One of them produced a bundle of pay stubs, showing the fraudulent weights and docked pay. Another had a small crate containing several sticks of dynamite and blasting caps, surplus from a recent tunnel excavation. Suddenly, the odds felt different. The ranch was no longer a home to be defended. It was a sanctuary, a small island of defiance in Pike's vast ocean of power. The next 2 days were a blur of frantic, purposeful labor. They would not wait for the attack. They would prepare a reception. Under Hastings' quiet direction, they transformed the ranch into a makeshift fortress. They dug a deep trench around the house and the print shop, a fire break against the inevitable torches. They piled up sandbags in the windows, creating protected firing positions, They chose their ground, planning sightlines and fields of fire. While the men worked, Nuda walked the land with Eliza. The old woman did not speak of rifles or barricades. She spoke of the earth. She taught Eliza to place her palm flat on the ground and feel for the tremors, the subtle vibrations that announced the approach of horses long before they could be seen or heard. "Listen," she urged. "The land will tell you when your enemies are coming." It was a lesson in a different kind of warfare, one of wisdom and listening, not just of powder and lead. Eliza felt a profound change within herself. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her stomach, but it was no longer the paralyzing fear of a victim. It was the sharp, focused fear of a soldier before a battle. She realized that love, the kind that was silently growing between her and Hastian, was not about whispered promises in the moonlight. It was about this. It was about filling sandbags together in the searing sun, about planning a defense, about the unspoken choice to stand shoulder to shoulder and face whatever was coming. It was an act of will, repeated with every shovelful of dirt, with every shared glance across the dusty yard. On the evening of the final day, with the 72 hours nearly gone, a quiet fell over the ranch. The work was done. All that was left was the waiting. Eliza went to her mother's old cedar chest. From it, she took a small folded piece of fabric, a strip of faded blue calico from the last dress her mother had ever made. She found Hastian by the corral, checking the readiness of the horses. She did not say a word. She simply took the bridle of his horse and, with steady fingers, tied the blue strip of cloth to the braided reins, just below the strands of dark hair from his own family. The faded blue of a homesteader's dress now lay against the black horsehair of a dying warrior. 2 pasts, 2 families, 2 histories, woven together, ready to face the dawn. The dawn did not arrive. It seeped into the world, a slow, gray dilution of the night's perfect black. The air was cold and still, carrying the scent of dust and the faint, resinous perfume of the high desert. Inside the ranch house, no one spoke. They were a small, determined garrison, each person at their post, watching the world materialize from the gloom. Eliza stood at the front window, the stock of her rifle cool and solid against her cheek. She felt the ground with the soles of her boots, trying to remember Nuda's lesson, trying to listen to the earth. It was not the earth that gave the warning. It was the wind. It shifted, carrying a new scent on its current, something sharp and unnatural. Kerosene. The smell was a promise of fire, a confirmation of their enemy's intent. Almost at the same moment, a sound tore through the stillness. It was a high, ululating cry, a cheap imitation of a Navajo war whoop, meant to terrify and deceive. "They are coming," one of the miners whispered, his voice tight. "Hold your fire," Eliza commanded, her own voice remarkably steady. "Wait for the trench. Wait for my signal." The first wave of riders burst from the gray dimness, a disorderly mob of about 15 men. They were grotesquely costumed with streaks of paint on their faces and feathers tied in their hair, a blasphemous mockery of the people they sought to frame. They charged forward, their horses' hooves drumming a frantic, chaotic rhythm on the hard-packed earth. The defenders watched, their knuckles white on their weapons. The riders came on, firing wildly, their bullets thudding into the sandbags and the thick adobe walls of the house. They were almost upon the trench when the led horse saw it, a dark line in the earth that did not belong. The animal tried to pull up, its eyes rolling in panic, but the momentum of the charge was too great. It happened exactly as Hastian had predicted. The horse stumbled at the edge, throwing its rider, and the horses behind it veered away in confusion, breaking the charge. The entire line of attack dissolved into a panicked, tangled mess of frightened animals and cursing men. "Now!" Mateo shouted from his position on the roof of the print shop. He struck a match and lit the fuse of a signal flare. It shot into the sky with a piercing whistle, exploding in a brilliant white shower of magnesium light. The entire scene was thrown into stark, momentary daylight. The attackers were exposed. their painted faces absurd in the harsh glare. "Fire!" Eliza yelled, and a coordinated volley of shots erupted from the house. They did not fire to kill, but to disable. They shot at legs and shoulders, aiming to unseat and disarm. Two of the attackers went down, clutching their limbs. Another's horse was hit and collapsed, pinning its rider. The fake raid had become a real and bloody fiasco. But some were still coming. A small group had skirted the trench and were advancing on foot, their intent clear. One of them, a wiry man with a burning torch in one hand and a can of kerosene in the other, broke from the group and made a desperate sprint for the house. He was the arsonist, the man sent to finish the job the fire at the barn had started. Eliza swung her rifle toward him, but her line of sight was blocked by another attacker. Before she could get a clear shot, a shadow detached itself from the side of the house. It was Hastian. He moved with a silent, lethal grace, not like a man running, but like a river flowing around obstacles. He held no weapon. His hands were empty. He met the arsonist just as the man was about to hurl the torch onto the porch roof. Hastian did not try to block the man's arm. He moved inside it, a fluid, turning motion that used the man's own forward momentum to spin him off balance. The torch flew from the man's grasp, landing harmlessly in the dirt. Hastian's hand shot out, not in a punch, but in an open palmed strike to the man's collarbone that made him gasp and drop the kerosene can. The fight was over in less than 5 seconds. Hastian twisted the man's arm behind his back, brought him to his knees, and with a length of leather thong he produced from his belt, bound the man's hands with swift, efficient knots. The takedown was a masterpiece of controlled force, decisive but not cruel. At the same time, another of the attackers, his face hidden behind a dark bandana, had reached the window where Eliza was positioned. He thrust the barrel of his pistol through the opening, firing blindly into the room. Eliza dropped to the floor as plaster exploded from the wall above her head. She knew she could not stay there. She scrambled to her feet and lunged forward, grabbing the hot barrel of the pistol with both hands and wrenching it downward. The man grunted in surprise, his finger still on the trigger. A shot went into the floorboards. He was strong, trying to pull the gun back, but Eliza held on with desperate strength, using the window frame as leverage. With a final, furious heave, she twisted the gun from his grasp. It fell inside the room with a clatter. The man stared at his empty hand for a fraction of a second, then tried to turn and run. "Not so fast," Eliza snarled. She reached through the window, grabbed the back of his collar, and yanked him off balance. As he stumbled against the wall, she reached up and tore the bandana from his face. In the flickering, dying light of the flare, she saw it. It was not the face of a stranger. It was a man she had seen in town, one of Pike's foremen, and pinned to the collar of his shirt, previously hidden by the bandana, was a small brass insignia, the emblem of Pike Consolidated Security. "This is not a Navajo raid," she screamed, her voice raw and carrying over the sounds of the fight. "It is Bartholomew Pike's private army. Look at his badge. It is Pike's man." Her words, and the sight of the unmasked, identified man, seemed to momentarily stun everyone. In that sudden lull, a new sound cut through the air. It was not a gunshot or a war whoop. It was the clear, authoritative sound of a military bugle, followed by a shouted command. "Cease fire. Lay down your arms in the name of the United States Army." Riding into the yard from the main road was a column of blue-coated soldiers, a dozen of them, moving with disciplined precision. At their head was Corporal Reeves. But he was not alone. Riding beside him were Aunt May and the courthouse clerk, Nora Bloom, who clutched a leather satchel to her chest as if it were a holy relic. For a moment, everyone was frozen, caught between two forces. Pike's foreman, his face pale with shock, stared at the approaching soldiers. The remaining attackers looked from the fortified ranch house to the line of soldiers, and the fight simply drained out of them. Corporal Reeves reined in his horse, his face grim and set. He did not look at Eliza. He looked at the foreman she had unmasked. "I have a warrant for your arrest," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that was new and absolute. "And for every man here with you, you are charged with attempted murder, arson, and conspiracy, under direct orders from Sheriff Kincaid and Bartholomew Pike." He held up a piece of paper. "I have a copy of the illegal confiscation order." He then looked at Nora Bloom, who opened her satchel and produced another document. "And we have a signed letter detailing the plan to incite a fake Indian war." The trap had sprung, but it was not Eliza who was caught in it. It was Pike. The foreman's face crumpled. "It was not supposed to be like this," he stammered. The battle was over, but it had not been without cost. From inside the house, there was a cry of pain. John, one of the miners who had joined their cause, had been hit in the chest during the initial volley. He was on the floor, his breathing shallow, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Aunt May was off her horse before it had fully stopped, rushing inside with her medical bag. She knelt beside him, her face a mask of professional calm, but her eyes full of a deep and terrible sorrow. The victory was real, but so was the blood. With the soldiers' rifles trained on them, Pike's mercenaries had no stomach for a continued fight. Two of them, seeing the utter collapse of their plan, threw down their weapons and put their hands in the air. "We surrender," one of them yelled. "We were just following orders. Pike paid us. He told us what to do, how to dress. He wanted it to look like a real raid." Nora Bloom was already there, a notepad and pencil in her hand, her face pale, but her expression determined. "Say that again," she said, her pencil poised. Slowly, for the record, she began to write, taking down the confession, a living testament to the conspiracy, right there in the dirt and chaos of the battlefield. Corporal Reeves gave the order, and his men moved efficiently, disarming the remaining mercenaries and binding their hands. The fraudulent war party was dismantled, its members now just a sullen and defeated collection of common thugs. Reeves posted 2 of his own men as guards at the ranch gate, establishing a cordon of legitimate law around the scene of the crime. The sun was finally cresting the horizon, its clean, honest light spreading across a scene of debris, blood, and exhausted relief. The adrenaline faded, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its place. Eliza found herself leaning against the adobe wall, the rough texture of the sun-baked earth a solid, reassuring presence at her back. Hastian came to stand beside her. He was covered in dust, a smear of blood from a cut on his cheek, but his eyes were calm. They stood in silence for a long moment, listening to the soldiers' commands and the low moans of the wounded man inside. They had won. They were still breathing. Eliza let out a long, shuddering breath and looked at him, a weary, incredulous smile touching her lips. "That coffee I owe you?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I believe this counts as payment." Hastian looked down at her, the faintest hint of his own rare smile in his eyes. He considered it for a moment. "Add a corn cake to that," he replied, "and we will call it even." The dust had not yet settled when the real law arrived. It came not in a chaotic charge, but in the form of a single, grim-faced man on a tired-looking horse. He was a United States Marshal, summoned by a telegraph wire that Corporal Reeves had sent before riding to the ranch. He possessed an authority that did not depend on the number of men at his back. He carried the full weight of the federal government in his quiet gaze and the set of his jaw. The arrests were an anticlimax, a procedural coda to a violent symphony. The Marshal, armed with the confessions, the letters, and Nora Bloom's meticulously copied ledgers, rode into Dry Mesa and straight to Bartholomew Pike's opulent office above the Silver Exchange. Pike, who had been directing his war from a distance, was caught completely by surprise. He protested, of course, his face turning a shade of purple that clashed with his expensive silk vest. He spoke of his contributions to the territory, of his powerful friends, of the misunderstanding that would be cleared up in a matter of hours. The Marshal simply listened, then produced a pair of handcuffs. Sheriff Kincaid was next. He was found in his office, attempting to burn his own logbooks, He blustered and threatened, his hand hovering near the pistol on his hip, but the fight had gone out of him. When he saw the cold, unblinking stare of the federal marshal, he deflated like a punctured feed sack. The two most powerful men in the county were loaded into a barred transport wagon, their journey to the territorial courthouse in Tucson beginning not with a bang, but with the quiet, ignominious click of a lock. The weeks leading up to the trial were a different kind of battle. One fought not with rifles, but with paper and memory. Eliza worked relentlessly at the desk in her father's study, the iron box of evidence open before her. She became an archivist of her own pain, collating the letters, cross-referencing the names in the bribe ledger with the dates of land sales, and annotating the blood-stained map. She wrote out her own testimony, her pen scratching late into the night, the words a careful, damning narrative of greed and murder. Hastian's preparation was of a different sort. He did not write pages of notes. He sat for hours by the limestone well, his eyes closed, his hands resting on the ancient, carved stones. When Eliza asked what he would say, he looked at her with his calm, direct gaze. The truth does not need many words. He said, "I will let it speak for itself." The courthouse in Tucson was a grand, suffocating building of brick and dark wood, a place designed to impress upon its visitors the immense, impersonal power of the law. After the vast, open sky of the high desert, the courtroom felt like a cage. Bartholomew Pike, dressed in a finely tailored suit, looked perfectly at home. He sat beside a lawyer from back east, a man with a silver tongue and eyes as cold and calculating as a banker's scales. The trial began, and Pike's lawyer went on the attack. He did not dispute the facts of the raid so much as he sought to repaint them. He portrayed Pike as a titan of industry, a civilizing force on a savage frontier. He characterized Mateo and the miners as disgruntled laborers with a grudge. He dismissed Nora Bloom as a hysterical spinster. When Eliza took the stand, he was merciless. He twisted her grief for her father into an unhinged vendetta. He depicted her alliance with Hastian as a betrayal of her people, the misguided actions of a lonely, impressionable woman who had fallen under the spell of a primitive. When it was her turn to speak, Eliza did not address the lawyer's accusations directly. She looked at the 12 men in the jury box, ranchers and shopkeepers not so different from the people of Dry Mesa. She spoke of her father, not as a victim, but as a man who believed the land had a voice. She spoke of water, not as a commodity to be bought and sold, but as the lifeblood of the desert, a sacred trust that belonged to everyone and no one. "This was never about a single ranch," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It was about the difference between building a community and owning it. Bartholomew Pike did not want to build. He only wanted to own." When Hastian was called, a murmur went through the courtroom. He walked to the stand with a quiet dignity that seemed to suck the air from the room. He wore no feathers, no paint, only simple cotton trousers and a blue shirt. The lawyer's condescending questions about his people's customs and beliefs were met with a profound, unnerving silence. When the prosecutor asked him to describe the importance of the limestone well, Hastian stood. He turned to the jury and began to speak, his voice a low, resonant baritone. He did not speak in English. He spoke in the flowing, musical cadences of the Dean language. The courtroom was utterly silent, the jurors leaning forward, captivated by the sound even though they could not understand the words. He spoke for a full minute. When he was finished, he paused, then gave the translation himself, his English precise and deliberate. He said, "My people do not have books of law written on paper. Our laws are written in the land, in the stories, in the water. That well is a story. It remembers the thirst of our grandmothers. It remembers the songs of our children. When you steal the water, you do not just steal something to drink. You steal our memory. Water is memory." His 4 words fell into the silent room with the weight of stones. The prosecution's case was built not just on Eliza and Hastian, but on a surprising chorus of other voices. Mateo Cruz took the stand, his arm still in a sling. and calmly recounted the ambush and the confession he had heard from the hired gun. Nora Bloom, no longer a quiet clerk, presented the court with Pike's falsified ledgers, explaining with cool precision how he had systematically cheated the territory. A woman who had worked as a cook in the mining camp testified, her voice trembling but firm, about the brutal conditions and the way Pike's security guards used fear as a tool of control. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. The prosecutor called Nuda to the stand. The old woman walked slowly to the witness box, her face a serene and timeless landscape. She needed no translation. She spoke in careful, accented English, her voice surprisingly strong. She did not speak of the raid or of Pike. She spoke of the well. She told the story of its creation, a tale passed down through generations, of how the holy people had placed it there as a gift. She described the markings on the stones, a calendar of the seasons, a history of her clan. She made the jury see it not as a resource, but as a cathedral. By the time she finished, there was not a sound in the courtroom but the scratching of the stenographer's pen. The verdict, when it came, felt both inevitable and miraculous. Bartholomew Pike and Sheriff Kincaid were found guilty on all counts: conspiracy, arson, incitement to riot, the murder of Eliza's father. The sentence was severe, decades of hard labor, and in a stunning addendum, the judge ordered that Pike's assets, all those gained through the fraudulent schemes detailed in the ledger, were to be seized and placed in a trust, to be used for the compensation of his victims and for the public good of the county. A collective sigh went through the gallery, a release of tension so profound it was almost a sound. The sharp, dry crack of the judge's gavel was the final punctuation mark. But victory had a price. In the weeks that followed, back at the ranch, Eliza found that the quiet she had longed for was now her enemy. In the silence, she heard the echo of gunshots. The sharp crack of a log in the fireplace made her jump. At night, she dreamed of the foreman's face in her window, and she would wake up, her heart pounding, her breath caught in her throat. The trauma of the siege was a wound that had closed on the surface but continued to ache deep inside. One evening, as she sat on the porch, struggling against a rising tide of panic, Hastian came and sat beside her. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply said, "Breathe with me." He placed his hand on the porch rail. "Now," he said, his voice a low, steady rhythm. "Breathe in as the sun rises. Hold it at the top of the sky. Breathe out as the sun sets. Rest in the quiet of the night." He guided her through the simple, ancient breathing exercise, his voice the only anchor in her spinning world. In, hold, out, rest, again and again, until the frantic pounding in her chest slowed and the world came back into focus. The court's ruling had sent ripples far beyond the verdict. The judge, moved by the testimony of Hastian and Nuda, had ordered the return of full water rights to the Hart Ranch, but with a new legal covenant. The area immediately surrounding the limestone well was to be designated a cultural heritage site, a protected buffer zone, accessible to the Duane for ceremony and sustenance. Forever. It was a victory beyond anything Eliza had dared to hope for. When they returned to Dry Mesa, the air was different. There was still resentment in some eyes. Men who had profited from Pike's schemes and now saw Eliza as the cause of their misfortune. The sign in the main saloon still read, "No bullies," a small, defiant monument to her stand. But down the street, another, smaller saloon still had its old, faded "No Indian" sign nailed to the door. The battle was won, but the war for the heart of the town was far from over. Justice had been served, but the world had not been magically remade. The season that followed the trial was not one of rest, but of deliberate, hopeful labor. The air, once thick with tension and the smell of smoke, now carried the clean scent of fresh sawn pine and the rhythmic rasp of saws. The 5 miners who had stood with them became the foundation of a new kind of ranch. They were no longer nameless, expendable laborers, but partners in reconstruction. They were paid a fair wage, the first they had ever known. drawn from the initial funds released from the Pike Trust. Together, they raised the frame of a new barn, its skeleton stark and promising against the blue desert sky. Hastian, working alongside them, showed them how to brace the walls in the old Dine way, interlocking the timbers for a strength that could withstand the fiercest winds. While the men built with wood and iron, Eliza returned to her press. She cleaned every piece of type, oiled every gear, and when the machine was ready, she began to set the first issue of a new paper. She named it The Dry Mesa Truth. The masthead was simple, the ink black and bold. The lead story was a straightforward account of the trial and the verdict, translated into both English and Dine, the two languages sitting side by side in the columns, a statement of purpose in themselves. On the second page, she created a new, recurring feature. It was called The Water Speaks. Hastian was its silent editor. Each week, he would tell her a story or a law of his people related to the land, and she would write it down, her words a careful bridge between his world and hers. It was a column about conservation, respect, and memory. It was the beginning of a new conversation for the whole territory. The seeds of community, once planted in the hard soil of conflict, began to sprout in unexpected ways. Under the shade of a large cottonwood tree near the main house, a small, informal school took shape. Aunt May, her spectacles perched on her nose, taught a mixed group of children, the miners' sons and daughters, a few children from the vaquero camps, and several young Dene children who walked over from their nearby camp, how to read from old primers and write their names in the dust. On other days, Nuda would sit with them, her voice a soft, mesmerizing cadence as she told them the old stories of the trail, of Coyote and the stars, teaching them a geography of the spirit. Mateo, his arm now healed, would take them to the corral and teach them how to ride bareback, to feel the rhythm of the horse, to become a part of the animal instead of just a passenger. It was a curriculum of survival and wonder, a school built on shared knowledge, not on walls. The love between Eliza and Hastian grew in this new atmosphere, not in grand declarations, but in the quiet spaces between the work. It was in the way he would appear with a cup of water when she was lost in her writing, or the way she would leave a plate of food for him by the forge where he was mending a broken tool. It was a partnership of shared labor and unspoken understanding. One night, after a long day of work, they sat by a small fire with Nuda and the children. The vast, velvet sky was awash with stars, so bright and close they seemed you could reach out and touch them. Hastian, at the children's urging, began to tell them the names of the constellations, the stories of the celestial hunters and the great cosmic coyote who had scattered the stars across the sky. He spoke of the North Star as the fire that never goes out, the anchor of the sky. When he finished, a quiet settled over the group. Eliza, looking into the flames, found herself speaking, her voice softer than usual. "Where I grew up, back east," she said, "we rarely saw so many stars. The sky was often cloudy, and the air was heavy with moisture." She told them about the rain, not the violent, sudden thunderstorms of the desert, but the soft, steady rains that could last for days, the world turning gray and green, the smell of damp earth a constant presence. She spoke of it not as a hardship, but as a different kind of beauty, a different kind of song. Hastian watched her, his expression intent, as if he were seeing the world through her eyes, a world of greenness and shadow to contrast with his own world of sun and stone. In the firelight, their two separate pasts, their two different landscapes of memory, met and found a common ground. Their bond was tested not by passion, but by the slow, grinding work of building a new civic order. At the first town council meeting held after Pike's conviction, Eliza and Hastian attended together. When a disgruntled merchant, a man who had profited from Pike's corrupt script system, stood up to protest the formation of the community trust, Eliza stood to counter him. She spoke with logic and force, and when she faltered for a moment, Hastian, standing at the back of the room, simply met her gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. She found her strength and won the argument. As they left the meeting, he wordlessly took her hand. his fingers lacing through hers, a public and private statement of unity. But the shadows of the old order were long and persistent. An unsigned letter appeared one morning, tucked under the door of the print shop. The words were crude, the letters cut from an old newspaper. "Traitor, your time is coming." Eliza burned it, but the ugliness of it lingered. A week later, a small fire broke out at the far edge of their pasture, a fast-burning grass fire that was quickly spotted and extinguished by Mateo's men. There was no proof, but everyone knew it was not an accident. It was a reminder that some of Pike's allies, the ones who had not been caught in the marshal's net, were still out there, nursing their hatred in the dark. Their own alliance, however, was also growing, strengthening its reach. A letter arrived from Corporal Reeves. He had officially been granted a transfer. He was now stationed at Fort Wingate, close enough to keep a watchful eye on the legalities of the new trust and to ensure that the federal government's promises were kept. Another letter came from Nora Bloom. She had quit her job as a courthouse clerk and accepted a position as a traveling correspondent for a newspaper in Santa Fe, her first major story. An exposé on the systemic use of fraudulent native raids by powerful land barons was already causing a stir across the territory. The seeds of truth they had planted were being carried on the wind. One morning, Eliza and Hastien walked out to the small plot of land near the house where they had planted a garden. The miners, men who had only ever known the darkness of the earth, had taken to the work with a surprising tenderness. Hastien had provided the seeds, kernels of dying blue corn, a hardy, drought-resistant strain that was as tough and resilient as his own people. And there, breaking through the reddish-brown soil, were the first shoots. They were a vibrant, almost electric green against the dry earth, tiny, defiant flags of life. They were a promise, a tangible sign that something new could grow here, something that was a blend of two worlds. Eliza knelt and touched a tender green stalk, its life force a palpable thing under her fingertips. Hastien stood beside her, and she felt his hand come to rest on her shoulder, a gesture of shared ownership, of quiet, profound hope. The house was not yet a home, and the peace was not yet secure. But here, in this small patch of green, their future was taking root. The first ceremony had been a shield, a hurried and desperate act of legal warfare conducted in the shadow of a rock face. It had been born of necessity, witnessed by the wind and a handful of worried faces. This second one was different. It was a choice, an affirmation, a thing of sunlight and open air. The idea grew not from a single mind, but from the community itself. A shared desire to see the union that had saved them, celebrated not as a strategy, but as a joy. And so they held a festival on the flat top of the mesa that overlooked the ranch, a place halfway between the sky and the land they had fought for. The entire improbable family of Dry Mesa was there. The miners, their faces scrubbed clean of coal dust, came with their wives and children. Mateo's vaqueros, their silver-inlaid saddles gleaming, brought guitars and stories. The people of Hastien's clan came in a quiet, dignified procession, their velvet blouses and turquoise jewelry, a vibrant river of color against the red earth. Even a surprising number of townsfolk made the climb, their initial skepticism having slowly given way to a grudging, then genuine, respect. The air was filled with the smells of roasting mutton and green chili, of coffee and corn cakes cooking over open fires. The sounds were a strange and wonderful harmony, the high, sweet cry of a fiddle played by an old ranch hand weaving through the deep, steady heartbeat of a dine drum. Children from all three groups, who a few months ago would not have met each other's eyes, now chased each other in a dizzying, laughing pack, their differences forgotten in the universal language of a game. The ceremony took place in the center of it all. Inside a large circle Nuda had drawn on the ground with a sacred corn pollen. There was no altar, only the vast expanse of the sky. Eliza wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton, and instead of a traditional veil, she wore a single, perfect eagle feather that Hastien had tied into her hair that morning. Hastian stood beside her, his bearing as calm and solid as the mesa beneath their feet. Nuda led the rites, her voice a comforting murmur, speaking first in Dine and then in English, her words weaving the two traditions together. Aunt May, her eyes shining with tears, stood for Eliza. Mateo, his hat held over his heart, stood for Hastian. There were no long, flowery speeches. The vows they exchanged were as spare and as true as they were. Eliza looked at Hastian, at the quiet strength in his face, and spoke from a place of newfound certainty. "I was taught that home is a piece of land you defend," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You taught me that home is the person you stand beside. My home is with you." Hastian met her gaze, and the smile that had once been so rare was now a familiar light in his eyes. He reached out and took her hand. "My path was a lonely one," he said. "It was a line drawn in the dust. You have made it a circle. I will walk in that circle with you, always." When it was over, the fiddle and the drum swelled together, and the mesa top erupted in celebration. In the midst of the dancing and feasting, a group of children from the little Cottonwood school gathered in a circle. They had made up a song, a simple skipping rhyme, and they sang it with the unself-conscious joy of the very young. Their high, clear voices carried over the crowd. The man with the silver tongue, he came with a smiling face. They offered diamonds and deeds to buy the sacred place. But the woman with the rifle, she stood up straight and tall. She chose a Navajo warrior to make the giant fall. With bare hands and an honest eye, he fought beside her then. They saved the water and the land, and made it home again. A ripple of laughter and knowing smiles went through the crowd of adults. The story was already passing into legend, becoming a part of the land itself. Eliza caught Hastian's eye from across the crowd, and they shared a silent, perfect moment of understanding. Later, as the moon rose, a great silver coin in the indigo sky, they slipped away from the dwindling fires and the soft music. A canvas tent had been set up for them at the far edge of the mesa, a private space overlooking the vast, sleeping desert. Inside, a single oil lamp cast a warm, flickering glow on the simple furnishings, 2 bedrolls, a small wooden table, a pitcher of water. They stood in the quiet, the energy of the day slowly receding, leaving a deep and peaceful calm in its place. "This is home," Eliza said, her voice soft in the stillness. "Not just the ranch, all of this, the people, the feeling that we are building something that will last." Hastian came to stand behind her, his arms circling her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "We are not finished building," he said. He spoke of his conversation with Mateo and the headman of the miners. They had a plan. Using the next portion of the community trust, they would build a public water station, a stone and timber structure with a deep well and a trough, open to any traveler, free of charge. Especially during the dry season, it would be a monument to what they had learned, that water was for sharing, not for hoarding. "And there is more," Eliza added, turning in his arms to face him. "Nora is helping me. We are using a portion of my father's inheritance to start a legal defense fund for any small homesteader or native family in the territory facing a fraudulent land claim. We will give them a voice, a fighting chance." He looked at her, his pride and love for her a tangible thing in the warm lamplight. "You have become a warrior, Eliza Hart," he said. "You fight with words and ink, but your heart is as strong as any shield." She smiled, a slow, contented smile. "And you are no longer so quiet. Hastian Nez, you have learned to speak in the council rooms as well as you speak to the land." They had met in the middle, his calm tempering her fire, her passion drawing out his voice. They were no longer 2 separate people fighting a common enemy. They were one, a balanced and formidable whole. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was a long, slow kiss, full of the day's joy and the quiet promise of the night. It tasted of wood smoke and the faint, clean scent of pine from the trees on the mesa. The lamplight flickered on the canvas walls. The world outside fell away, and there was only the 2 of them, their shared breath, and the certain, unspoken knowledge that their life together was just beginning. Just before they had left the celebration, Aunt May had found Eliza by the fire. She had come with a shawl, warding off the evening chill. "You are looking well, child," she had said, her eyes, full of a midwife's wisdom, taking in the subtle new fullness of Eliza's figure, the radiant, healthy glow in her cheeks. "You have a deep strength now, a new life growing." She had patted Eliza's arm, a knowing smile on her face, and then had discreetly walked away, leaving Eliza with the quiet, joyful confirmation of a secret she had only just begun to suspect herself. The future felt full of promise, but it was a promise that still had its shadows. Mateo had quietly given them a piece of news. One of Pike's primary investors, a silent partner from back east with a reputation for ruthlessness, had not been implicated in the trial. He had slipped away, his whereabouts unknown. The snake had been slain, but one of its eggs might yet be hidden in the rocks, waiting for the right time to hatch. As they prepared to leave the mesa the next morning, Hastian brought out a new set of reins for his horse. He had been braiding them for weeks. They were a beautiful, intricate work of art, woven into the dark. Strong strands of horsehair were threads of pale, sturdy flax, a gift from Eliza's own stores, and at the very top, where he would hold them, he had carefully braided in the faded blue strip of calico from her mother's dress. The past and the future, her world and his, the homesteader and the warrior, all twisted together into a single, unbreakable cord. The story of a place does not end when the guns fall silent. It begins. The moral of the fight for Dry Mesa was not written in the court records in Tucson, but in the calluses that formed on the hands of the men who raised the new barn, and in the quiet shift in the eyes of the people who had watched the battle from the sidelines. The lessons were simple and hard-earned. Justice, they learned, was not a gift from a distant judge, but a garden that had to be tended in the full light of day, with truth as its shovel. Love was not a single, fiery declaration, but a choice remade every morning with the rising of the sun. And water, the thing that had started it all, was life itself, a force too essential to be used as a weapon, a truth too profound to be poisoned by lies. The impact rippled outward, slow and sure, like the rings from a stone dropped in a still pond. The public water station, built with the first funds from the community trust, was completed by the end of the summer. It was a sturdy structure of stone and timber, with a deep, hand-cranked well and a long, cool trough that was never allowed to run dry. One sweltering afternoon in late August, a wagon train of weary migrants, their animals and children gaunt with thirst, crested the rise. They expected to be charged a steep price for a few buckets of water. When Hastian, who was inspecting the well pump, told them the water was free for all, the exhausted father simply stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief and then dawning, tearful gratitude. That single act of grace did more to change the reputation of Dry Mesa than 100 sermons. The ugly, faded signs barring natives from establishments began to disappear, not through any law or edict, but through a quiet, collective sense of shame. One day, the sign at the smaller saloon was simply gone, leaving only a pale rectangle on the weathered wood, a ghost of old hatreds. The Dry Mesa Truth became the territory's most unlikely and influential newspaper. Nora Bloom's articles, syndicated in Santa Fe, sparked federal investigations into two other powerful land barons who had used the same tactic of the fake raid. Letters began to arrive for Eliza, not from powerful men, but from small ranchers and homesteaders in distant counties, asking for advice, for help. The legal fund she had established with her father's inheritance had its first case, and won. The changes in Eliza and Hastian were as profound as the changes in the land. Eliza, who had begun as a solitary woman fighting a lonely battle of defense, had become a creator, an architect of community. She was no longer just the publisher of a newspaper, but the anchor for the water station project and the legal fund. She fought her battles now in council meetings and with carefully chosen words set in lead type, and she found the victories just as satisfying. and far more lasting. Hastian's transformation was quieter, but no less significant. The silent, watchful shadow who had moved on the edges of the world had stepped into the light. He had not lost his stillness, but it was no longer a shield against the world. It was a source of strength from which he could now teach. The children of the Cottonwood School adored him. He showed them how to read the story of the day in the tracks left by a coyote, how to find water by watching the flight of a bee, how to know the season by the angle of the sun. He spoke to them of the 9 laws of harmony, of not taking more from the land than you needed, of respecting the lives of all creatures. He was no longer just a warrior. He had become a teacher, a bridge between the ancient wisdom of his people and the uncertain future of this new blended community. Their family was not defined by blood, but by the shared choice to stand together. Their loyalty was not a given, but a thing they earned from each other every day. They learned that maturity was not about growing harder, but about knowing when to be soft. It was understanding when to stand your ground with a rifle in your hand, and when to win the war by taking your husband's hand and walking into a town meeting, your head held high. One clear, cold night, with the first hint of autumn in the air, they walked from the house to the limestone well. The sky was a vast, deep ocean of stars, and their reflections shimmered on the dark, still water below, as if the well held its own universe. The new barn stood as a dark, solid silhouette against the star-dusted sky. From the small cabins where the miners' families now lived, they could hear the faint sound of a fiddle, and then a ripple of children's laughter, clear and bright on the night air. The well, which had been the source of the conflict, was now a mirror for the heavens, and the land, which had been soaked in blood and fear, now echoed with the sounds of a community at peace. Life in Dry Mesa was not perfect. The maps of the territory were still a tangled mess of conflicting claims, and they all knew that men like Pike were not a unique breed. New threats could arise, for greed was a weed that grew well in any soil. Freedom, they understood, was not a prize to be won and then placed on a shelf. It was a state of constant vigilance, a fire that had to be tended every single day. But they were no longer afraid. The future was unwritten. The small school under the cottonwood would grow. New roads would be cut across the desert, and soon, a new life, their child, would be born into this world they had fought so hard to build. They would face it all together. 2 people who had become one, a quiet man and a strong woman, forever watching to make sure the light they had found would never go out. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through the heart of the Old West. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share in this story together. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like this video, and give it a boost by pressing the hype button so that this tale can be shared with and heard by even more people.